Hi, I'm Andrew.
And I'm Dave, and we are the IB English Guys. This is video number 3. This is part of our Paper 2 series from start to finish, where we're going to look carefully at the entire Paper 2 process. Just a reminder, this is just a slice of our Paper 2 resource that is available on our website, but it's also a part of our whole school resources.
Yeah, in our last video, we looked at the story A Family Supper by Kazuo Ishiguro, and we talked about the story in great detail by going over a one-text chart. We then encouraged you to complete the chart for one of your Paper 2 texts as well. Today, we're going to go ahead and look at the short story called Stones, and that's written by Timothy Finley, and he's from Canada. Again, as we go over the story, the idea is to show you our thinking for our Paper 2 text, We Go, and then you have a blank organizer for You to Go, where you're sort of using our teaching and then working through your text in a very similar process.
Yeah, and Stones is a rich story, and it spans 15 to 20 years, and it's narrated by Ben. He's again looking back. He's an adult looking back at his childhood, looking back at his experiences, and especially in terms of his father, who was a soldier in World War II. And again, this is a story about a man who returns from war. He returns from war really, a fractured human being. And again, the son is dealing with the fact that his father was one way before he went to war, and then returning from war, he's distant, he's verbally and physically abusive to his family, he drinks. And again, this mystery is eventually unraveled, and we learn that his father committed an act of cowardice where he froze in battle, which soldiers do sometimes. And again, this guilt that he felt is manifests itself in all this family trauma that the narrator undergoes.
That's a great synopsis. Now, as you deliver that synopsis, I can't help but have my comparative mind going back and forth between the two texts. Of course, that's not what we want to do today. We're going to save that comparative work for the next video. The goal for today is just to go over this text 2, in great detail so we understand that text independently of the other.
Okay. We're going to go back to our chart. We love charts. They help us kind of organize our thinking. And again, walk through briefly some of the things that are in our chart. Our chart's linked below so you can see that in detail. The first thing we want to think about is the author's background. Who is Timothy Finley? We want to think about that. He's a Canadian novelist, so he's coming at from his perspective being Canadian, but also growing up in Rosedale, which is where the text takes place.
Yeah, and that's interesting to me because when we do some research about Rosedale, we find that that's a community that's kind of split, between the haves and the have-nots, and that comes into play in the story as well. So it appears that this author may be using some of his background as he crafts a story. Now, Paper 2 is not a place to talk extensively about context and background, but knowing this little nugget of information might help you deliver some insight while you're writing the paper.
That's true. I mean, no text is written in a vacuum. So we want to think about it. This is coming from a time and place. It's not our main purpose in Paper 2, though. So we want to think about now, we want to think about the fact that it does take place in Canada, in Rosedale. And again, it's thinking about as a pre-World War II story, but also goes through, it's a post-World War II story. So it spans that entire time. Before the war, after the war.
Yeah, and I know I don't want to do this, but I can't help but think about text 1 where it took place in a day. And now we have this one taking like 20, 30 years, right? So right away, I'm starting to see these inherent little comparative points.
Next video, sorry. Okay, narrative point of view. The narrator is Ben. He is an adult. He's 54 years old to be specific, and he's looking back at his childhood and being a young adult while his father is encountering all these.
Yeah, this is important because when you look back, typically you're nostalgic. So you might want to think about your text as well and think about who is narrating this story. Are they nostalgic? Do you have first-person point of view? Do you have third person? Is it omniscient? So really think about that as you're going through your text today.
Yeah. Then again, we like that idea of a plot review or a walkthrough of the text. Again, the scope of this video is not to go into details about all the intricacies of this story, but we want to think about that the story begins with Ben thinking about what his life was like before the war, and then it has the part where the father comes back, during the war, where he's come back from battle, and then the course of time where his father's abusive, and then eventually that idea of kind of coming to grips with what his father did, but also sort of grieving and having some closure. And in essence, that's what the story's about.
Folks, look how quickly and look how well he did that. That's what you need to be able to do with your Paper 2 text. You need to just to be able to go right through those plot points beginning to end, because that's not the crux of the assignment. It's just assume that every candidate knows the plot. You need to do that rich analysis and interpretation. So the plot just has to come out quickly.
And eventually you want to do it where you're not looking at your notes. How much is up here? How much can I really retell that story in detail? And then you can go back and look at your notes and fill in the gaps.
Yeah.
That, again, will help give you confidence.
Mr. Giles, I really find the narrative structure of Stones quite interesting. We have, these flashbacks later in the story of Dieppe. We have, where the father is in the present tense. We're sort of going back and forth throughout time. So the structure is going back and forth through time.
Yeah, that's complicated, right? You'll see moments where he darts out of the narrative where he's like reflecting on what's happening now. So I think that's, again, an aspect that's interesting to talk about. But again, we have that idea of the Great Depression and the pre-war years, but then those breaks in time are interesting, and then lots of flashbacks.
Yeah. Next, I think, just as always, we want to think about the different characters. We want to think about the protagonist, the antagonist. Are there foil characters? Sort of what role are these characters playing, and what topics and themes are being fleshed out? So would you mind taking the father, Mr. Giles?
Yeah, we want to think about the father, and to me, it's about the father, undergoing change. Like, what was the father like prior to going to war? He was patriotic. He felt like he was had a calling, and he was proud of, showing courage to go to war. But then afterwards, he's very distant, and he's really depressed, and he's, resorting to alcohol and some of these things to numb his pain.
Obviously a dynamic character. So you want to think about who are the dynamic characters in your text, what types of change and transformation, which is one of our concepts, what kind of transformation do they go through? Who's the antagonist, and how do what's their character arc look like? So you want to be thinking about all these aspects of characters.
Yeah, and again, you can see what we've done with the characters and kind of coming up with some things. The next thing we want to talk about is conflicts. And again, like our previous video, we really tried to break down some of the conflicts. One big conflict in this text is man versus society, human beings, and what they're expected to do. And again, this is what the father is kind of wrestling with, that expectation that a soldier is going to be brave in battle.
Sure, and that spills over into a man versus self, because he beats himself up over his inability to act. Think about Hamlet with his inaction. Well, this is a similar character where he's going crazy seemingly because he's unable to process it and struggle with his inaction.
Yeah, that's right. And it's also like the idea of, human versus human, and that conflict that exists in the family and how they're dealing with aspects of the father.
So take some time on your chart and make sure you identify some clear conflicts that you think could drive a good paper 2 response, okay? And we can also do that with themes.
Yeah, topics and themes. We want to think about the idea of grief. Now, that's a topic, the topic of grief. But again, what does this text say about grief and how people deal with grief and loss?
It talks about that individual grief, but it talks about that collective grief as well. So again, you really want to have these rich discussions with your classmates, with your teacher, and when you're doing this thematic work, really go beyond the obvious and look for those nuances, subtleties, and implications. That's where you're going to make your money.
We can talk about societal obligations and the societal pressure, and again, how society often ostracizes those who don't meet those expectations. This is what this text is about. So again, these are topics and themes to talk about.
Once we've talked about those rich topics and themes, Mr. Giles, we definitely want to explore those symbols. We did this with the family supper, and we think you're going to want to do this with your 2 texts as well. What are some of the prominent symbols we see in Stones?
Well, we see flowers. Again, they own a flower shop, and this idea of flowers being, this idea of, symbolic of love and beauty, but also fragility. But then the stones, and the stone is, again, the title of the story, but the stones have a very rich symbol because, again, this idea of how we cast stones in society, but also at the end, the father wants to be buried. He wants his to be honored at the beach where he committed his act of cowardice, to be a stone among stones.
Yeah, and you just made me think it might be wise to add a box to this chart for the title. Stones, what is the meaning of the title? A family supper, what is the meaning of the title? And how is it significant? That might be another comparative point.
Yeah, so we can unpack those symbols and talk about them. But like our previous video, we want to think about the signature moves, the broad authorial choices that the author uses to craft this story. So what are a few of them?
Yeah, I think that Timothy Finley is really great with his imagery and dialogue. I think we really get some insight into the characters and the things they say, and he's very rich with describing the setting. So for me, that rich visual imagery and that dialogue really punches in this story. How about you?
I like flashback and the way he's that nonlinear structure, and that flashback, this idea of reflection, because he's reflecting back. The idea of memory and how that's important.
There's also a point in the story where there's direct address to the reader. And I love when writers sort of branch off into that second person perspective point of view where they challenge the reader with a question or something. Yeah. We see that in this story as well.
It's like breaking the fourth wall. I love that. So then the last thing is we're thinking about, okay, yeah, we can't memorize, 50 quotes from Stones. That's not realistic.
That's not the point.
But there might be some nuggets of language that we can talk
Folks, if you know your stories, you know your text well, you're going to have notable nuggets just floating around in there. You're not going to have to memorize them. You know your text so well, they just live there. My father was returned is one that I just cannot unsee or unthink from this text, Mr. Giles.
He may never be kind again.
a stone among stones, right? I think that's taps into the title. It comes late in the text. It's just, there's a lot of notable nuggets that if I were writing my response, I'd want to have these at the ready. And I know I'm going to use these to show superior knowledge, show those nuances and those interpretations.
Yeah, so that was our brief deconstruction of a really rich story that we hope you enjoyed. Now it's your turn. Now we'd like to invite you to take your second text. And again, like you did in the previous video, take your second text and fill out your chart. Fill out your graphic organizer. Do it with a friend, perhaps, and really unpack that story so you're grounded in it.
Teachers, move this chart to landscape, open it up as a shared Google Doc for your whole class, and be amazed at what your students can populate. It's collectively, you can build knowledge, understanding, and interpretation. It's a great way to have a shared experience and do some critical thinking as a group.
Sounds like you've done that before.
Sounds like I've done it before. In the end, we hope this video has been helpful for you. We'll come back in the next video, and now that we've looked at the two stories independently, we'll start looking at some comparative charts. And once we've done that, we'll be ready to start moving into the actual Paper 2 process. So stay with us, and we're going to walk you step by step, we go, you go, through Paper 2. See you soon.
Good luck, guys.